Elena worked at a small cafe that stood on the corner of a quiet street. Every morning she would unlock the doors, sweep the floor, and turn on the warm yellow lights that gave the place its cozy feeling. The cafe was not fancy, but people loved it for the smell of coffee and the sound of laughter. In one corner near the window there stood an old piano. The wood was scratched and a few keys had lost their shine. Most people thought it was only there for decoration, but for Elena it was the reason she loved her job. She had found the piano the very first day she started working there. When she pressed one of the keys, the sound that came out was soft but sweet, and it stayed in her mind. From that day, she started to touch the keys whenever she was alone. It became her quiet secret. She never told anyone that she could play, not even her co-workers. No one had taught her properly. She had learned from watching videos on her old phone and by listening carefully to songs. The piano was her escape, her way to forget everything else. Elena lived alone in a small room above the cafe. It was simple, with a bed, a table, and a window that looked out onto the street below. She did not have much, but she never complained. Life had not given her many easy days. She had grown up in a small town, where her family struggled to make ends meet. Her father worked far away and her mother did sewing at home. There was never enough money for things like music lessons. When she was younger, she would stand outside the school hall and listen to other children play piano. She would close her eyes and imagine that she was the one sitting on the stool, her fingers dancing across the keys. Years passed, and life pushed her toward work rather than dreams. But the dream never really left. When she played the cafe piano at night, she felt like she was talking to the only friend who truly understood her. The sound filled the quiet room with warmth. Sometimes she would play soft melodies, and sometimes she would make up new ones that no one had ever heard. The music carried her feelings, the loneliness, the hope, the little joys she could not explain in words. Her boss, an older woman named Mrs. Grant, often left before closing time, trusting Elena to lock up. That was when the cafe became her world. She would wipe down the tables, put the chairs back, and then sit at the piano. Her fingers would tremble at first, but once she started, she forgot everything. The tiredness, the bills, the long hours. The old piano seemed to understand her heart. It did not matter that some keys were broken or out of tune. It still sang for her. One night as she played, rain started to fall outside. The streetlights made the raindrops shine like little stars. Elena played a slow tune, something gentle and full of feeling. She closed her eyes, letting the sound carry her. She did not know that someone was standing outside, listening through the glass. A man on his way home had stopped when he heard the music. He stayed there for a few minutes, completely still, watching her play. When she finally stopped, he smiled and walked away quietly, not wanting to disturb the moment. Elena never knew that small moments like these touched people. She thought she was invisible, just another face behind the counter. During the day, she served coffee and pastries, always polite but quiet. Customers liked her calm voice and kind eyes, but few really talked to her. She had a soft way of smiling that made people feel at ease, though she never spoke much about herself. Some thought she was shy and others thought she was just tired. Only the piano knew the truth, that her silence was filled with unspoken music. Every night she promised herself she would play better. She watched tutorials and tried to copy the movements of professional pianists. Her phone screen would glow in the dark room as she studied the way they used their fingers, how they made each note sound alive. Her piano was missing 2 black keys, so she learned how to work around them, changing songs to fit what she had. She laughed sometimes at how strange it sounded, but she didn't care. It was her sound, imperfect but hers. One evening, after a long day at work, Mrs. Grant asked her to stay late and help clean up after a group event. There were leftover cups and crumbs everywhere. As Elena worked, the others left one by one until she was alone again. She glanced at the piano, feeling that quiet pull inside her. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down and began to play. The melody was simple, something she had made up herself. It spoke of tired days and hidden dreams. Her fingers moved with more confidence than before, and her heart beat in rhythm with the notes. She did not notice that Mrs. Grant had returned to get her forgotten umbrella. The older woman stopped in the doorway, surprised by what she heard. She stood there for a while, listening to the young girl play. When the music stopped, Mrs. Grant spoke softly. "That was beautiful, dear. I didn't know you could play like that." Elena jumped in surprise, her cheeks turning red. She tried to laugh it off. "Oh, it's nothing, ma'am. Just something I do when I'm bored." But Mrs. Grant shook her head with a smile. "That's not nothing. You have a gift." For the rest of the night, Elena couldn't stop thinking about those words. A gift. She had never thought of it that way. To her, it was just something she loved. Something that kept her from feeling too small in a big world. But maybe there was more to it. Maybe what she played could mean something to others, too. The next few days felt different. When she looked at the piano, she saw it with new eyes. She still played after closing, but now she tried harder. She practiced small details. The way she touched the keys, the way her hands moved. She began to feel proud of herself just a little. Sometimes she caught herself smiling at the sound she made. Still, she never thought anyone beyond Mrs. Grant would care. Then, one afternoon, a man came into the cafe with a calm, thoughtful look. He was older, with gray hair and kind eyes. He ordered coffee and sat near the window, right beside the piano. Elena served him and went back to the counter. The cafe was quiet that day with only a few customers. After a while, she noticed the man looking at the piano. He asked her if anyone played it. She hesitated and said softly, "Sometimes I do when it's empty." He smiled and asked if she would play something. Her heart jumped. "Now?" she asked, almost whispering. He nodded gently. For a long moment, she stood frozen. No one had ever asked her to play in front of them. She looked around. There were only a few people, all busy with their phones or drinks. Finally, she sat down at the piano. Her hands were shaking so badly she thought she might not be able to start. She took a deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound filled the cafe, gentle and trembling at first, but then it grew stronger. The man closed his eyes, listening. Elena forgot her fear as she lost herself in the melody. When she finished, the room was quiet. The man opened his eyes and smiled warmly. "You play with your heart," he said. Then he introduced himself as a music teacher. Elena didn't know what to say. He told her he had been teaching piano for more than 20 years, and he rarely heard such natural emotion in someone's playing. He asked if she would like to take part in a small community recital his school was hosting. She laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but he was serious. "It's nothing big," he said kindly. "Just a few students and some friends. You can play something simple if you like." Elena thanked him but said she wasn't ready. The thought of standing in front of people made her stomach twist. Still, he handed her a small card with his contact information and said, "Think about it." That night, Elena could not sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The rain tapped softly against the window. She kept hearing his words, "You play with your heart." She imagined herself sitting on a real stage, a grand piano shining under bright lights. She imagined the sound echoing through a large hall. Then she laughed to herself. It felt impossible. She was just a cafe worker with an old piano and big dreams. But something inside her whispered that maybe it was time to stop hiding. When morning came, she went downstairs to open the cafe. She looked at the piano and smiled softly. She touched one of the keys and it rang clear and sweet in the quiet room. For the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to let the world hear her music. The next morning, Elena woke up earlier than usual. The sun had just started to rise, painting the small room with soft orange light. She sat on the edge of her bed, still thinking about the man who had listened to her play and invited her to the recital. His words echoed in her mind again and again, that she played with her heart. She wanted to believe him, but another voice whispered that she wasn't good enough. She sighed and rubbed her hands together, trying to shake off the thought before heading downstairs to open the cafe. The cafe was quiet that morning. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and soft music played from the radio. As she cleaned the counter, she looked over at the piano near the window. It looked ordinary again, like any old piece of furniture. She smiled to herself and whispered, "You almost got me into trouble last night." She didn't know if she would ever have the courage to play in front of people again. The thought of sitting on a stage with everyone watching made her heart beat faster in a way that was not pleasant. Still, deep inside, a small part of her was curious. What if she really could do it? When Mrs. Grant arrived later that morning, she noticed that Elena looked thoughtful. "You're quiet today," she said kindly. "Is everything all right?" Elena smiled softly and nodded. "Yes, just a little tired." She didn't want to talk about the recital. It felt too unreal, like something that belonged to another world. She poured coffee for a few regular customers and went about her day as usual. But the thought stayed with her, like a soft song she couldn't stop hearing. Days passed, and life at the cafe continued as always. People came in for breakfast, shared laughter, told stories, and left again. Elena smiled and served them, all while carrying her secret music inside her heart. Each night after closing, she would play for a few minutes before heading upstairs. The piano's sound felt like a friend's voice, comforting and familiar. But lately her songs had changed. They carried a new kind of longing, a sense that she wanted something more. One afternoon, when the cafe was nearly empty, the same man returned. She recognized him instantly, though she tried not to show it. He smiled when he saw her. "I was hoping I'd catch you here," he said kindly. "Did you think about what I said?" Elena froze for a moment, unsure how to answer. She wanted to say no, but her heart wouldn't let her. "I did think about it," she said softly. "But I don't think I'm ready for something like that." He looked at her with gentle patience. "No one ever feels ready," he said. "But you don't need to be perfect. You just need to share what you already have." She looked down, feeling her cheeks grow warm. "I only know how to play by ear," she admitted. "I can't read sheet music. I just play what feels right." The man smiled. "That's exactly why you should play. People can learn technique, but they can't learn emotion. You already have that." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "The recital is next Saturday evening. You can come just to listen if you want. No pressure." Then he left, leaving her standing there with the paper in her hand. That night she couldn't help but look at the paper again and again. It had the address of a small music school and the date and time of the event. She told herself she wouldn't go, but she kept it in her apron pocket just in case. Each time she played the piano, she imagined how it would feel to play in front of others. She imagined people sitting quietly listening. The idea both scared and excited her. She didn't know which feeling was stronger. As the days passed, her nerves grew stronger. One evening, as she played after closing, Mrs. Grant came in quietly and sat at a table near the window. "You're getting better," she said with a smile when Elena stopped. "Your music sounds more alive lately." Elena laughed shyly. "Maybe because I've been thinking about something," she said. Mrs. Grant tilted her head. "Something or someone?" she teased. Elena shook her head quickly, embarrassed. "No, nothing like that. Someone invited me to play at a small recital." Mrs. Grant's eyes lit up. "Really? That's wonderful. Are you going?" Elena hesitated. "I don't know. I've never done anything like that before." Mrs. Grant leaned forward, her voice soft. "Dear, you have a gift. You shouldn't hide it forever. Sometimes we have to be brave, even when it feels scary." Elena nodded slowly, but her stomach tightened. The idea of people staring at her made her palms sweat. Still, that night she practiced longer than usual. She told herself she would go just to listen, not to play. That way she wouldn't have to face the fear, but could still be part of it somehow. When Saturday arrived, the cafe was busier than usual, and the day passed quickly. By the time she closed the doors, the sky outside had turned a deep orange. She went upstairs and sat on her bed, staring at the folded paper again. The clock ticked loudly in the room. It was almost time. Her heart pounded as she picked up her coat. "Just to watch," she whispered to herself. Nothing more. She took a deep breath and stepped outside. The music school was only a short walk away, but every step made her more nervous. The building was small but bright, with warm lights shining through the windows. She could hear faint music from inside, a soft melody played by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. She stood by the door for a long moment before finally walking in. A kind-looking woman greeted her and showed her to a seat near the back. There were maybe 20 people inside, talking quietly and waiting for the show to begin. The man she had met at the cafe was at the front, talking to a few students. When he saw her, he smiled and gave a small nod as if to say, "I knew you'd come." She smiled back nervously and looked down at her hands. As the recital began, one student after another walked up to the piano and played. Some were children, their feet barely reaching the pedals. Some were adults who played slowly but carefully. The music filled the room, and Elena felt a mixture of admiration and fear. They all looked so confident. When it was almost over, the man stepped forward and thanked everyone for coming. "Before we finish," he said, "we have one more person who I hope will share something special with us tonight." Elena's heart jumped when he looked directly at her. The audience turned their heads toward her seat. She froze, unable to move. "Miss Elena," he said kindly, "you don't have to if you don't want to. But I think everyone here would love to hear what you can do." For a moment, the room seemed to spin. Her hands shook. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Mrs. Grant's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes we have to be brave." She stood slowly, her knees weak, and walked toward the piano. The room went quiet. She sat down, staring at the black and white keys. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the polished surface. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling fingers. At first, she just played a few notes, testing the keys. They sounded so different from the old piano at the cafe, smooth, rich, alive. She started with the simple tune she always used to warm up, something easy and familiar. But as she played, the fear began to fade. The melody flowed naturally, and she lost herself in the sound. Her heart led her fingers, and the music grew deeper, fuller. She forgot the people, the stage, the lights. It was just her and the piano, the same way it had always been. When she finally stopped, the room was silent. She looked up, unsure what to expect. Then someone started clapping, and soon the whole room joined in. The sound filled her ears, and she felt her eyes sting with tears. She smiled shyly and stood up. The man walked to her side and whispered, "See? I told you. You just needed to share what was already inside you." She nodded, unable to speak. That night, as she walked home, the city felt different. The lights seemed brighter, the air warmer. She felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time in her life, she had played not just for herself, but for others. And the world had listened. The days moved slowly as the recital came closer. Every morning, the thought of it sat quietly in the back of her mind like a shadow she could not shake. She tried to focus on work, taking orders at the cafe and smiling at customers. But the sound of the piano always called her back. After closing, when the chairs were stacked and lights dimmed, she sat at the old piano, pressing its chipped keys with both fear and love. The same tune played over and over again, yet it never felt right. Some nights she would stop midway, sigh, and bury her face in her hands. She wanted to do well, but she was scared of what would happen if she failed. The piece she was asked to play was simple. That was what the teacher had said. But the simplicity made it harder because every wrong note stood out. Every pause felt louder. Her hands were not used to playing in front of anyone. Alone, they were confident. In silence, they danced. But when she imagined an audience watching, her fingers trembled and the music faded. She would close her eyes and whisper to herself that she was just playing for herself. But even that comfort faded as the night of the recital drew closer. Her small apartment was filled with the soft echo of music. The neighbors could sometimes hear it, and some would pause by the door to listen. She did not know that. She thought she was invisible, hidden in her quiet world. But music has a way of reaching others, even when one tries to hide. She practiced until her wrists ached, until her breath came heavy, until her eyes burned from the dim light. She wanted to make it perfect, not for anyone else, but to prove to herself that she could do something beautiful. Sometimes she thought about giving up. She told herself that it was just one performance, and if she said she was sick, no one would mind. She almost sent a message to the teacher to say she could not come. Her hands hovered over the phone, trembling, but something inside stopped her. It was not pride. It was something quieter, hope. A small hope that maybe this was her chance to feel something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She could not explain it, but it was strong enough to keep her from quitting. Her best friend, Mia, noticed her quietness. One evening, when they met at the park, Mia asked why she seemed so lost. She hesitated at first, but then told her everything about the recital. The fear, the shaking hands, and the feeling that she would not be good enough. Mia listened carefully, then smiled in her warm way and said, "You play with your heart, not your hands. That's what people will remember." Those words stayed in her mind like a soft echo. Every time she sat at the piano afterward, she thought of that. Play with your heart, not your hands. So she began to change the way she practiced. Instead of focusing only on the notes, she began to feel the story behind them. She closed her eyes and imagined herself telling something through the melody. Something about loneliness, about dreams, about everything she had never said out loud. Her playing began to shift. It was still the same simple tune, but it now carried warmth. It sounded alive. When she finished a piece, she would sometimes smile without realizing it, her fingers still resting on the keys as if the music had not yet ended inside her. The teacher visited the cafe one afternoon. He asked her how she was preparing, and she smiled nervously, saying she was trying her best. He told her not to worry about perfection. People remember feeling, not flawlessness, he said softly. If you play honestly, no one will forget you. Those words filled her with both comfort and fear. Honesty in music meant showing herself, and that was something she had always avoided. But maybe that was what she needed to do. Maybe that was the real test. As the recital drew near, her routine changed. She came home earlier, turned off her phone, and spent her evenings at the piano. Sometimes she would just listen to the sound of each key, pressing them gently, almost like talking to them. The piano had been her only friend for years, and now it was her voice. She played in dim light, her hair falling over her face, her lips moving silently as if whispering to the notes. There were moments when tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness but from a strange kind of peace that music gave her. The night before the recital, she barely slept. Her mind was full of sounds, the first note, the last note, the applause she both feared and hoped for. She imagined the stage, the grand piano that was not like her old one. She imagined the crowd, the faces she did not know. She wondered if her hands would obey her or if fear would take over. When the morning came, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the sky that slowly turned gold. The world looked calm, but her heart was not. She whispered quietly to herself that no matter what happened, she would play honestly. That evening, she went to the auditorium for a short rehearsal. The place was larger than she imagined, with rows of seats that looked endless. The grand piano stood in the middle of the stage, its black surface shining under the lights. When she touched the keys, they felt smooth and perfect, nothing like the old piano at the cafe. For a moment, she felt like she did not belong there. She looked at the empty seats and felt very small. The teacher came up to her and said, "It's just a piano. It doesn't know if you are rich or poor. It only knows truth." That made her smile a little. She played softly, testing the sound. It was clear and rich like water flowing, but it also scared her because it was so clean. There was no hiding here. Every note was exposed. After a few minutes, she stopped and looked at the teacher. He nodded gently, saying, "You're ready." She wanted to believe that, but doubt still sat in her chest like a stone. That night, she returned home quietly. She sat by her window again and watched people walking by. Everyone seemed to know where they were going, and she wondered if they ever felt as unsure as she did. Her piano stood quietly in the corner, waiting. She went to it, pressed one key and then another. The sound filled the room like a whisper. She began to play, not to practice, but to say goodbye to this small, safe space before she faced the world. It was the same tune she would play at the recital, but tonight it felt different, gentle, calm, and full of life. When she finished, she kept her hands on the keys for a while, her eyes closed. She could feel her heart beating fast, but it was no longer just fear. It was something else, excitement maybe, or courage. She smiled to herself. The piano had taught her that music was not about being perfect. It was about being real. The next day would be her first step into a world she had only dreamed of. She was not sure if she was ready, but she knew she would walk onto that stage and play as herself. She would not hide. She would let the music speak for her. The thought both scared and comforted her at once. As she lay in bed that night, the sound of her final note still lingered in her ears. It was as if the piano was whispering that it believed in her. She smiled faintly in the dark, closed her eyes and let the sound carry her into sleep. The stage awaited her, and so did her moment of truth. The fear was still there, but so was hope. And sometimes hope is louder than fear. The morning of the recital came with a gray sky and soft drizzle. She stood by her window, watching raindrops slide down the glass, each one catching a faint glimmer of light. Her stomach felt tight, and her hands were cold even though she had wrapped them around a cup of tea. Every sound in the small apartment seemed louder, the ticking clock, the rustle of her coat, even her own breathing. It was the day she had promised herself to be brave, yet all she wanted was to stay inside and hide from it. She whispered to herself that it was just a small recital, just one performance, nothing more. But deep down she knew it meant much more than that. It was the day she would stop running from who she was. She reached the small music school earlier than expected. The teacher greeted her warmly, noticing the tension in her face. "You'll be fine," he said gently. "Remember what I told you and play with your heart." She nodded but couldn't speak. Her throat felt dry, and she could feel her heart pounding so hard that it made her chest ache. She went to the dressing room and set her coat aside, smoothing the simple dress she had chosen. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and comfortable, something that made her feel like herself. She looked in the small mirror, trying to smile, but it looked forced. She sighed and whispered again, "Play with your heart." As the evening approached, people began arriving. Parents, friends, and a few strangers who loved music. The small auditorium filled with the soft hum of voices, laughter, and the faint smell of flowers. She peeked from behind the curtain and felt her knees weaken. There were more people than she had imagined. Some sat quietly, holding programs in their hands. Others chatted softly, waiting for the show to begin. She turned away quickly, her hands trembling. Her teacher noticed and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be perfect," he said. "Just tell your story through the piano." One by one, the students performed their pieces. Each one brought a different sound, a fast rhythm, a slow ballad, a soft lullaby. The audience clapped warmly for all. She sat backstage, listening to every note, feeling both admiration and fear. When the performer before her finished, she felt the air in her lungs vanish. The teacher called her name gently, and she froze for a heartbeat before standing. The applause faded into a heavy silence. She stepped onto the stage, the lights bright on her face, the world suddenly too large. The grand piano stood there like an old friend waiting patiently. She sat down, feeling the smooth bench beneath her. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and thought about all the nights at the cafe. The quiet room, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain outside. She remembered how the piano there had felt beneath her fingertips, how no one had been watching then. Slowly, her breathing steadied. She opened her eyes and began to play. The first few notes came softly, unsure, like footsteps on unfamiliar ground. But as the melody grew, something inside her shifted. The nerves faded into the background, replaced by a calm she didn't expect. The music filled the room with warmth, tender, pure, and full of emotion. She played not to impress, but to share something honest. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that seemed guided by memory and feeling rather than thought. The soft melody turned deeper, richer, like a story unfolding without words. The audience grew silent. Even the faint whispers stopped. The rain outside tapped gently against the windows as if it were listening too. Her hands glided from one end of the piano to the other, her eyes half closed, lost in the sound. The tune was simple, but in her hands it became something else. Something that carried sadness, hope, and beauty all at once. Every note seemed to reach out, touching the hearts of those listening. Near the end, her fingers slowed, letting the final notes linger in the air. For a moment, there was no sound at all. The silence felt heavy, sacred, as if no one dared to move. Then the applause began. Slow at first, then growing louder, filling the room with warmth and light. She blinked in surprise, her breath catching in her throat. People were standing, clapping, smiling. Some even had tears in their eyes. The teacher stood near the stage, smiling with pride. She stood slowly, unsure what to do. The sound of the applause felt unreal, like something happening in a dream. Her heart raced, but now it was not from fear. It was joy, pure and overwhelming. She bowed slightly, her hands trembling again, but this time it was from emotion, not nerves. As she stepped away from the piano, she could still feel the vibration of the final note inside her chest. Backstage, the teacher met her with a proud smile. "You did it," he said softly. "Do you see now? You didn't just play a song, you shared yourself. That's what true music is." She couldn't find words, only nodded, her eyes shining. It felt as though something had changed inside her, something small but powerful. The girl who once hid behind the cafe piano had stepped out into the light. After the recital, a few people came to speak with her. Some thanked her for the performance, others said her music had moved them. One woman said she hadn't cried in years until that night. Each word felt unreal to her, but also beautiful. She smiled shyly, her voice quiet as she said thank you again and again. The teacher watched from a distance, knowing she had taken her first real step toward believing in herself. When she left the hall that night, the rain had stopped. The streets were wet and shining under the streetlights. She walked slowly, the night air cool on her face. She didn't rush. She wanted to feel everything, the peace, the exhaustion, the quiet pride. When she finally reached her small apartment, she sat by the window again, just as she had that morning. But now everything felt different. She was still the same person, yet something in her heart had opened. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had trembled so many times before, and smiled softly. I did it, she whispered. Not to anyone else, but to herself. She knew this was only the beginning. The world was still large and full of uncertainty, but she had faced her fear and shared her gift. For the first time, she felt truly alive. The night stretched on quietly, but the music still lingered in her mind. It was not the sound of the piano that stayed with her. It was the silence that had followed, the stillness of the crowd, the moment when every heart in the room had been listening. She realized that music wasn't about fame or applause. It was about connection, about the feeling that even for a brief moment, everyone shared the same heartbeat. As she drifted to sleep that night, the memory of the applause faded, but the warmth in her heart remained. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing: she would keep playing. Because now, she understood that music wasn't something she did. It was something she was. That night after the recital, she hardly slept. The applause still echoed in her mind like waves that refused to fade. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces in the crowd, the way they had fallen silent, the way some had wiped tears from their eyes, the way they stood when she finished. It felt unreal. She had dreamed of moments like that, but had never believed they could happen to her. Now that it had, she didn't know how to hold it. She lay awake for hours, the moonlight slipping across her walls, wondering if she would ever feel something that strong again. The next morning, she went to the cafe as usual. Life there looked the same. The smell of coffee, the quiet hum of morning chatter, the sound of spoons tapping against cups. Yet everything felt different to her. She smiled more easily, moved more lightly as if a heavy weight had lifted from her shoulders. The owner looked at her and said, "You look brighter today." She only nodded, not sure how to explain it. Inside her, a quiet confidence had begun to grow. Something small but alive. Later that day, her teacher stopped by with a soft smile. He placed a folded paper on the table and said, "Someone from the recital wanted to speak with you." Her heart jumped. She opened the note slowly. It was from a woman who had been in the audience, a music organizer who ran small community events. The note said that she had been deeply moved by the performance and wanted her to play at a charity concert the following month. She stared at the letter for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. Another performance, another chance. Fear and excitement mixed inside her once again. She walked home that evening with the letter still in her hand. The sky was clear, the streets glowing in soft orange light. She read the words again and again. The thought of standing on stage once more both thrilled and scared her. What if the first performance had been luck? What if she could not feel that same magic again? But then she remembered the teacher's words, "Play with your heart." That had been the key. She smiled faintly, tucked the letter into her pocket, and whispered to herself, "I'll do it." The next few weeks passed in quiet rhythm. Every evening after work, she returned to the piano. But this time her practice felt different. There was no nervous rush or panic. She no longer played to prove herself. She played to feel, to breathe, to speak without words. Her music began to change, and softer, deeper, more personal. It was as if her hands had finally learned how to tell her story. Sometimes she caught herself smiling as she played, not realizing it until the melody ended. The piano no longer felt like a test. It felt like home. Mia often visited during these practice sessions, sitting nearby with tea, listening quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't give advice. She just listened, and that was enough. One evening, after a particularly moving piece, Mia said softly, "You sound different now. It's like you've found yourself in the music." She looked up and smiled shyly. "Maybe I have," she said. "For the first time, I'm not afraid to be heard." When the day of the charity concert arrived, she felt calmer than before. It was not a grand event like the recital. The hall was smaller, filled with warm light and the hum of gentle conversation. The people who came weren't dressed formally. They were families, neighbors, and a few music lovers who just wanted to hear something real. That made her feel comfortable. She didn't feel the same fear that once paralyzed her. Instead, she felt gratitude for the chance to share again. Before her turn came, she sat quietly backstage, her fingers resting on her lap. The teacher came by once more, this time with a gentle laugh. "You look peaceful," he said. She smiled. "I am," she answered. "I just want them to feel something." He nodded. "Then they will. When her name was called, she walked to the stage with steady steps. The lights were softer this time, the crowd smaller but kind. She took a deep breath and sat down at the piano. She didn't close her eyes like before. Instead, she looked at the audience, their curious, expectant faces, and felt a connection even before she played a single note. Then she began. The melody flowed easily. It wasn't the same piece as before. It was something new she had been working on in quiet moments. It started softly, a tender rhythm that felt like the sound of a heartbeat. The music told of gentle mornings, quiet rain, and silent courage. It rose slowly, carrying emotion without shouting. As she played, her hands no longer shook. Every movement felt natural, every note true. The room fell silent again, just like before. But this time the silence felt like a conversation, as if the audience understood her without needing words. When the final note faded, the applause came softly, then louder. People smiled through tears. A few stood not out of surprise but out of deep respect. She bowed her head, her heart full. This time she didn't feel shocked. She felt peaceful. She had not just played well, she had shared something real. That was all she ever wanted. After the concert, people approached her again. They asked where she had learned, if she taught, if she had recordings. She laughed nervously, saying she only played for herself. But one older man said, "Don't stop. The world needs the kind of music that comes from truth." His words stayed with her long after the night ended. Weeks passed, and she began to notice small changes around her. More people came to the cafe after hearing about her. Some asked if she would play there again. At first she hesitated. The piano at the cafe was old and uneven, its keys slightly broken, but it was where her journey began. One evening after closing, she sat down and played softly. The sound filled the quiet cafe just like before, but now it felt different, freer, stronger. The owner stood near the door, smiling. "It's good to hear that piano alive again," he said. She smiled back, still playing. Soon people began to gather outside when they heard her play. Passers-by stopped, listening from the street. Some even stepped in, buying coffee just to sit quietly and listen. The small cafe became a place of warmth and music. It was never loud or crowded, just peaceful. A place where strangers felt connected through simple melodies. She didn't think of fame or recognition. All she wanted was to make people feel something. Even for a moment, sometimes late at night, she would think about how far she had come. From the girl who once hid behind fear to the woman who now played with open hands and an open heart. It hadn't been easy. There were still moments of doubt, times when she wondered if she truly deserved the praise. But each time she touched the piano, the music reminded her that what mattered was honesty, not perfection. The teacher still visited from time to time, always with a proud smile. He would listen quietly, then say, "You've found your voice." She would laugh softly and answer, "Maybe I just stopped hiding it." They both knew the truth. She had become what she was meant to be. Not a famous pianist, not a flawless performer, but a storyteller through sound. On one quiet evening after the cafe had closed, she sat by the window again, just like on that first rainy morning. But now, instead of fear, she felt calm. The night outside was peaceful, the streetlights glowing softly. She placed her hands on the piano keys and began to play a gentle tune, something new, something only for herself. The melody drifted through the air, light and full of peace. In that quiet room, she realized something simple but true. She didn't need a big stage or a crowd to feel alive. The music itself was enough. It had always been enough. The same piano that once echoed her loneliness now carried her joy. And as the final note faded into silence, she smiled, knowing her journey wasn't ending. It was just beginning, one song at a time. The weeks after the concert passed quietly, but her life no longer felt the same. People who once barely noticed her now smiled and greeted her when they came into the cafe. Some even asked if she would play again. The old piano in the corner, once just background decoration, had become something special to many. Every time she sat down to play, a few people would stop what they were doing and listen. It was never a big audience, but it was enough to fill the place with warmth. She played softly, letting the music blend with the sound of coffee cups and laughter. For her, that little cafe had become more than a workplace. It was where her dream had quietly taken its first breath. One afternoon, a young boy came into the cafe with his mother. He stared at her as she played, and when she finished, shyly asked, "Can you teach me how to do that?" She smiled gently and said, "Of course you can. You just need to listen with your heart first." The boy nodded, eyes wide, and she felt something inside her shift. Maybe this was what she was meant to do, not just to play, but to inspire others to find their own voice through music. The thought stayed with her long after they left. Her teacher visited her again one day, carrying a small envelope. Inside was an invitation to a local arts festival that featured young musicians. He told her, "They want you to play. No competition, no pressure, just music." She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready for another stage. But then she remembered how it had felt the last time she played. Not the applause, not the lights, but the peace that came from being true to herself. So she agreed. The festival took place in an open park surrounded by trees. It wasn't a grand hall, just a simple stage with a few rows of wooden benches. Families sat on blankets, children ran around with balloons, and the air smelled of roasted corn and laughter. It felt easy, unpretentious, just the way she liked it. When her turn came, she walked calmly to the piano, wearing a simple white dress. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. This time, her song was different. It was soft at first, gentle as a whisper, then slowly grew brighter and fuller. It spoke of quiet mornings, rainy evenings, and the courage that comes from not giving up. The wind carried the sound across the park, and people stopped to listen. Even the children paused, their playful voices fading into silence. For a few minutes, the entire park seemed still. When she finished, there was a long pause before the applause began, not wild or loud, but warm and sincere. She looked up and saw smiles everywhere, people nodding quietly as if they understood what she had meant to say without words. After the performance, a journalist approached her. He said he had heard about her story, the cafe, the recital, the music that had touched so many hearts. He asked if he could write about her for the local paper. She hesitated, shy as always, but finally agreed. The article came out a week later, titled "The Girl Who Plays from the Heart." It told of her simple beginnings, her fear of being seen, and how she found her courage through music. She didn't expect much from it, but the response surprised her. People from other towns began visiting the cafe just to hear her play. Letters arrived from those who said her story had given them hope. Some were musicians who had lost confidence. Others were just people who needed a reminder that beauty can come from ordinary places. She read each letter slowly, sometimes with tears in her eyes. It felt unreal that her music, something so personal and quiet, could touch lives she had never met. One letter came from a woman who said, "I was afraid to try again after failing, but your story reminded me that it's never too late." Another said, "You made me believe that dreams don't have to be loud to be real." Those words became her greatest reward. Months passed, and her life found a peaceful rhythm. She continued working at the cafe, still playing the same old piano, though now the keys were worn from so much use. The owner sometimes joked about replacing it, but she always said no. That piano had seen her fear, her tears, and her triumph. It was a part of her story. Every evening when the sun dipped low and the crowd thinned out, she played a soft tune, not for fame or applause, but because music was her way of breathing. One evening, her teacher came to see her again. He watched her play quietly from a corner table, sipping his tea. When she finished, he walked over and said softly, "Do you realize how far you've come?" She smiled modestly and said, "I don't think about it that way. I just keep playing." He nodded. "That's why people listen. You remind them that real music doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from truth." His words filled her with quiet pride. She had never chased recognition, but hearing that meant more than any award could. As the years moved on, her small performances became a local tradition. Every month, people would gather in the cafe for what they called evenings of stillness. No microphones, no big lights, just her, the piano, and the sound of hearts slowing down to listen. Sometimes she would look up mid-song and see faces completely still, eyes closed as if they were somewhere far away. That, she thought, was the magic of music. It gave people a place to rest. She also began teaching children, including the little boy who had once asked her how to play. Watching them learn reminded her of her own journey, the fear, the uncertainty, and the moment she found courage. She told every student the same thing. Don't worry about being perfect. Just tell your story through the keys. If you play with honesty, the world will listen. Some of them grew up to play beautifully while others simply learned to love music. That was enough for her. One night after the last customer left, she stayed behind in the cafe. The lights were dim, the streets outside quiet. She sat at the piano, touching its worn keys, feeling the smooth spots where her fingers had rested thousands of times. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who was too shy to play when others watched, the one who doubted her worth. She smiled softly, realizing how far that girl had come. The journey hadn't been about fame or success. It had been about finding her own strength. She began to play again, softly at first. The tune was one she had never played before, something new, something that felt like goodbye and beginning at the same time. The music floated into the quiet night through the open window out into the sleeping city. She didn't know who might hear it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was free to express, free to feel, free to be herself. When the last note faded, she sat in silence for a long time, her heart full. The room smelled faintly of coffee and rain. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of laughter, life continuing as it always had. She closed her eyes and smiled. She knew there would be more days, more songs, and maybe even more stages. But no matter where life took her, she would always remember the moment it all began, when she was told to play a simple tune and ended up touching hearts in a way she never imagined. The world outside would keep changing, but the music inside her would remain. It had carried her through fear and into freedom, and as long as she could sit at a piano, as long as her hands could move across the keys, she knew she would never be alone again. For her, music wasn't just sound, it was the language of the soul. And in that quiet cafe, under the soft glow of the evening light, her story continued. Not as a performance, but as a promise that sometimes the simplest melodies hold the deepest truths.